This, viewers, is a South African flag. In fact, everything you see on this wall came from South Africa on one of my many, many trips to that land. But I want to start here with the South African flag. You see the colors in this flag? The black represents the black population of South Africa. The green symbolizes the land and the natural wealth of South Africa. The yellow represents the country's rich mineral resources. The white stripe you see here on the flag stands for peace and the European population, which is the minority in South Africa. The red represents the sacrifices made in the struggle for freedom and the fight against apartheid. And then the blue symbolizes the sky and the two oceans that surround South Africa. South Africa has the Indian Ocean on one side and the Atlantic Ocean on the other side. In fact, if you go to Cape Point in South Africa, that is where the Indian Ocean and the Indian Ocean and the Atlantic Ocean meet each other and they repel. Only by an act of God. When you stand at Cape Point and you see the Indian Ocean does not impede upon the Atlantic and the Atlantic does not impede upon the Indian, then you can understand in great detail that great hymn of the church, How Great Thou Art. Why did I start with the flag? Because for 4 weeks, you've been listening and learning about women liberators. And I have the distinct pleasure to conclude this month's series with one of the greatest women liberators in the history of South Africa and of any nation in the world, Miss Winnie Mandela. Winnie Mandela. She was born in 1936. I had the distinct pleasure when Nelson Mandela was freed from prison, and one of the trips that he made was to Atlanta, Georgia. And I was a part of the welcoming committee along with Governor Zell Miller, Senator Charles Walker, Mayor Andy Young, Mayor Maynard Jackson, as we welcomed Mandela to our city. And then we had the distinct honor of meeting and hosting his wife, Miss Winnie Mandela. Unfortunately, all of my pictures from that time period, except for a few, were lost because she didn't have cell phones to record them. Winnie Mandela, and I'm going to slowly pronounce her middle name because she was Xhosa. If you ever saw the movie Black Panther, Xhosa is the language that they speak in that movie. Her correct name is Winnie Mandela, born in 1936. She was born in the same place as Nelson Mandela, the Eastern Cape. South Africa, Cape Town, you have the Eastern Cape and the Western Cape. She was born in the Eastern Cape. She was an anti-apartheid activist. The apartheid, or apartheid, how we decide to pronounce it, depending on the etymology of the word spoken in South Africa versus America, apartheid or apartheid. Apartheid was South Africa's version of segregation, which began there in 1948, separate but equal. There are many mementos in my house, on my refrigerator, magnets and other things, and cups, mugs to drink coffee. I don't drink coffee, drink tea from, that has whites only, blacks only. So the apartheid there was horrible. Her husband, Nelson Mandela, aka Madiba, fought against that. But she was one of the great women liberators who fought for the freedom of South African people. Often called the mother of the nation in South Africa, she was a powerful and controversial figure. You cannot look at her power without looking at her controversies. While she was a symbol of resistance, she was also connected to violence and political scandals. And I understand that. We don't justify any violence. But here's a woman who was beaten and scorned, had her husband snatched away from prison for 27 years. She was humiliated in solitary confinement. And she had a righteous indignation, a righteous anger about her. So that anger did not always lead her to make the best decisions or the right decisions at that particular moment. Example, the tire burning around this young man's neck who was a traitor. The Bible says, be angry and sin not. But her controversial moments, do not let the media fool you. Her controversial moments do not take away from her greatness as a liberator. When Nelson Mandela went to prison, when he was arrested, it was Winnie Mandela who kept his party alive. His party was the ANC, the African National Congress. Now, the ANC is very controversial today because it has had, unfortunately, some presidents or members of that Congress that have not done the right thing. But she kept it alive while Madiba was in prison. After the apartheid ended, she served in the South African government. She was a member of government. Not only did she fight to liberate the people, but she became a part of the government. She was as important to the work of Nelson Mandela as Coretta Scott King was to the work of Martin Luther King Jr. Let me repeat that. Winnie Mandela was just as important to the work of Nelson Mandela as Coretta Scott King was to the work of Martin Luther King Jr. After Mandela was sentenced to life in 1964, Winnie became one of the most visible figures in the fight against apartheid. She endured arrest, torture. This is why she had such anger. They tortured her. Surveillance. Wherever she went, she was under surveillance. And house arrest by the apartheid government. They sought to control her. They tried to break her. How many of you know you cannot break a strong-willed black woman? Ask Rosa Parks. They told her to stand up. She sat down. Ask who? Sojourner Truth. She kept marching. Ask Harriet Tubman. She kept leading and liberating. In 1969, she was detained for 17 months in solitary confinement and continued to face government harassment in the 70s and the 80s. They tried to run her in the ground, but Winnie was not to be denied. Winnie kept fighting. She kept standing up. She kept being strong because while Madiba was in jail, she put that nation on her back. She put that nation on her back. Her activism made her a symbol of resistance, much like we have to do in these terrible, toxic Trumptonian times. We must practice resistance. And she became the de facto face of the ANC, the African National Congress, while her husband was in prison. By the 1980s, her reputation took hits because of some of the controversial decisions. Her marriage with Nelson Mandela ended in divorce in 1996. And though she remained a powerful figure, her influence waned in the post-apartheid era. But being a historian, I want to put this in perspective. Her influence may have waned, but her work was still solid. Influence can wane, but the work outlives you. Martin Luther King's work outlives him. My favorite hero, Adam Clayton Powell Jr., his work outlives him. Winnie Mandela, her work outlived her. In her later years, despite the controversies and all these other things that had happened, she was engaged in helping the poor and the working class. Her life came to an end April the 2nd, 2018, at the age of 81. At her state funeral, she was recognized as a revolutionary icon who made deep sacrifices for South Africa's liberation. While her legacy remains complex and polarizing, she is remembered both as a freedom fighter and a figure who stood for her people at all costs. So I hope that you've enjoyed these 5 weeks that we've brought to you women liberators from around the world. Our history must be taught. They cannot erase our history. Teach our history in churches. Teach our history in private schools. Teach our history in synagogues. Teach our histories in mosques. Teach our histories in fraternities and sororities. Thank you for tuning in to 2025 March Women Liberators, Black History Women that we featured this month, Women Liberators. Thank you.